social media influencing is not the same as journalism. I hope whoever needs to hear this hears it.
Andy, no. February 27th, 2025. Through it. Thanks for joining us another week. My name is Jared Holt.
And I'm Michael Edison Hayden.
You'll notice in your podcast players, this show has a new logo. We got to give a shout out.
Yes, that's my sister. I know her as Katie Hayden, but I believe she goes as her design name or whatever for her work is Catherine Antoon. She's really playing up the Arab part of her. But yeah, she did this for free because she's such a nice younger sister, and I love her very much.
Thank you so much, Katie. I feel like it captures the energy of the show a lot better than what we were using, which felt a little NPR-ish. This is not really an NPR-ish show, despite my vaguely monotone Midwestern delivery style.
Yeah, once I showed up, the phone broke. So.
Huge news in Washington this week. They finally released the Epstein files, as evidenced by the Staples sale rack binders with a sheet of printer paper slipped in the front that were handed to a cadre of right-wing influencers who were subsequently paraded around in front of the White House. The
reality is that they brought a bunch of influencers into the White House. People who you would not know unless you had fifth degree brain poisoning. And they gave them binders full of information that was already publicly available and did a photo op with them to show that they released the Epstein files. And then when they released these people into the world, they were bullied by their own fans.
Yeah, one of the people who DC Drano, Rogan O'Hanley's his name. He posted a video and he's like, all right, I'm opening the binder. Here it is. And he's flipping through these pages and it's just big fat black bars of redacted information. But yeah, so all of these influencers are paraded around the White House. They got Oval Office pictures. You know, they really, it's like when I call my dog over and scratch his head a little bit and I say, who's a good boy? Who's a good boy? And then I give him the same treat he always gets. Yeah. So they did this with influencers. You had a lot of folks, like you said, if you wouldn't know who these people are unless you have brain poisoning, but you had this Rogan O'Hanley guy who is just kind of a stock MAGA influencer, postures himself as anti-corruption.
Who Twitter suspended. Twitter suspended him, and then he was one of the first prominent, influencers that Musk brought back.
You had Scott Pressler, who is a very openly gay Republican who is
tall and has hair like Fabio, and is just an extremely bizarre figure in every way. Just his whole vibe is really, really weird. And he spent all of the election in Pennsylvania trying to sign up, register people to vote. That is his main thing, is just voter registration of MAGA people.
Initially in his career, he just started as a hell yeah, I love Trump poster, got a job at ACT America, which is an anti-Muslim hate group. He doesn't talk much about it. I almost wonder if he really understood what he signed up for there. But yeah, now he is just true. I almost have to hand it to him. He's a force of nature in organizing local Republicans. He has gotten so many people registered and, kind of whipped up about election denial-ish type of things. You had Liz Wheeler, who is a host on One America News, which is
she still on One America News, or is she? I don't actually know.
Maybe former. I can't.
Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. I just remember it It was like the Wheeler Report or something like that. I just remember seeing whenever I would turn on One American News.
If you don't know what One American News is, it is like, imagine if Fox News was more intense. Oh, you're thinking of Newsmax, maybe. Now imagine if that was worse. That's like what One American News is.
With like Kremlin talking points and at least 2 years of Jack Posobiec being a leaden anchor for them.
You had Chaya Raichik, who I'm probably butchering the pronunciation of her name.
Doesn't matter.
She runs the Libs of TikTok account, which has millions of followers on Twitter.
Yeah, and her entire thing is just harassing trans people. Like that's basically her entire thing.
Yeah, it's just picking like a random gay school teacher in Nebraska and then sicking millions of people on them. You had Mike Cernovich, who
sorry,
real heads will know. I feel like he's lost some of his cachet. I was almost surprised to see him there, you know?
He looks almost like syphilitic or something. He's got, like, he doesn't look well, you know? He's like, if you see Mike, for people who don't know Mike, also known as Weird Mike, shout out to Vic Berger, shout out to Nathan Bernard. He was this guy who is sort of a men's rights, male supremacist, men's health guru who wrote a book called Gorilla Mindset. And he on his old live streams would say then Gorilla Mind and stuff like that. Like it was like it was Vic Berger would loop these in videos.
He
like
sold nootropics.
Yeah,
you could get Gorilla Mind pills, which I once took. I convinced him to send me some, and I took some.
What you took is your life in your hands. But yeah, I mean, Weird Mike was there. He's a very interesting player in the Epstein files because he's the one who like immediately turned on it and tried to pretend that you know he was too good for it after everybody like you know lashed out at him.
And then you had Jack Posobiec, who we've been talking about it for weeks. I think Jack Posobiec is going to get his own episode of the show pretty quick.
Yeah, he's forced our hands to deal with him directly.
The only thing holding us back is figuring out if we can do it in an hour or if we need to come up with a new show format to cover it. But he was, God, man, where do you even start with him? He was a Game of Thrones fan fiction blogger who went super MAGA
with lots of like fascist and Nazi stuff like in his background, right? Like I mean, a lot of weird posts that involved extreme fascist movements and things like that, and also a lot of Russian Kremlin-backed influence campaigns that he participated in. Yeah,
he was informally, I suppose, underling of Roger Stone, the longtime GOP operative who is willing to crawl in the dumpster and do the dirty work. Turned into a prolific conspiracy theorist and is now appearing on stage with the president and is a major figure at one of the largest conservative youth activist organizations, Turning Point USA.
Well, before we get into this, but it was the big moment. I have a lot of thoughts on this, but like the big moment in which I feel like the fringe broke in mainstream was Jack standing in the White House. Like it's JD Vance on one side, Jack on the other side, and Trump in the middle. And that's like in the photo. And also Cernovich also appeared in a photo like that. Right. And it's sort of like that framing of like that, like triangular framing is the moment for me where like the extremist fringe was just like totally it totally broke now.
The Epstein files got a lot of excitement. I mean, like for these online feverish, right-wing media junkies, right-wing social media junkies. It's very exciting. The influencers they know and love, they're at the White House and oh my God, they've finally got it. We're going to learn the truth about Jeffrey Epstein, only to get documents that were already public and are heavily redacted. Just like I said, big black bars noting that the information is sensitive or classified in some way by the government. Just all kinds of outrage followed, and outrage towards these influencers who I think it was a rare moment of like self-awareness, I think, by this media ecosystem, which was, of course, quickly blanketed over by all kinds of psycho conspiracy theories and spin. But there was that flash of awareness of like, wow, these people are real dupes. And I made a comment online about like the average high schooler has a harder time landing their prom date than this White House has had getting the big right-wing influencers to just go parade around and like perform tricks for them. They just jangle like a little bit of access. In this case, a challenge coin. They hand out some challenge coins, and these people will just...
What's a challenge coin so people understand?
A challenge coin is a little coin. It's popular in like military circles. If you like do a mission or you're part of a team or something,
right,
you get a little coin.
Well, I got to read Laura Loomer's tweet, and then we also got to read Mike Cernovich's tweet because those are so critical. So for
Laura Loomer was not invited to the White House for this.
I think that was strike one for them because she was going to go after their ass. She for people who don't know, she's an anti-Muslim poster. She's like tried many times to run at least twice to run for office, didn't work. Then wound up inside Trump's plane. I'm skipping over so much, like when she locked herself to the doors of Twitter. But one thing about Laura is she will say what she really thinks, and she gets on Twitter after this and starts writing, "There are no Epstein files." This is all caps, by the way. "The binders are props. Every single one of those right-wing paid influencers lied to all of you today. They engaged in deception to run for cover for pedophiles." Not wrong. By the way, not wrong. "They posted selfies with prop binders. Liars and deceivers." She's talking about people like Jack and Mike, who she used to associate with very closely. Like she and Jack staged this thing where they, interrupted a performance of Julius Caesar in the park back in the day. So this is some real heavy infighting.
Loomer was one person. You had the philosopher Cat Turd, who is just a random dude in Florida who makes pee-pee and poo-poo jokes about Democrats and has since become a coveted personality among several of our elected officials and top news networks like Fox News. Said, "Send these scumbag traitor agents to prison and throw away the key." It's just God,
so good. And then we also got to let people know about Mike Cernovich's spin, which is he's like, "Am Bondi wanted to get out what she could. She's a lawyer, not a media personality, and the OODA loop got fucked up. It happens. Trump admin is being sued 1,000 times. Terrorists are attacking." Sorry. "Everyone is working 24/7. No one has a magic wand." Boy, that's like, talk about throwing shit at the wall. I love the terrorists. I love the terrorists get thrown in.
I mean, it's what we were talking about last week with Max Reed, the soy right, where it's like, yes, even in power, they're just, listen, man, things happen. You can't win them all. We're just people. And the terrorists are attacking. So,
there's terrorists attacking right now. It's not our fault that the Epstein binders don't have anything in them but black lines.
We could go forever on this, but just zooming out, I really do think you have to be like a mark to keep falling for this. But so many people are happy to be those marks, or it's like entertaining. It is, something to latch on to in a political landscape that a lot of people just find completely uninspiring and bleak. But if you think that the Trump administration is going to war with the deep state, which they now own, by the way, which now works for them. Yes. By the way,
well, they've also eliminated. They've been using DC Drano, right? Or like that's what Musk is doing.
To think that they are legitimately going to tear apart these systems of surveillance, these systems of aggressive policing, these systems of authority that they benefit from, the secrecy that they benefit from, you have to, it's like.
Loomer is 100% right. I can't believe I'm saying this about covering up for pedophiles. Because if there's information about Epstein that hasn't already been public, and maybe there's not a lot, we don't know. Maybe there's not much, right? Everybody thinks there's big secrets that they're, maybe we know quite a lot about Epstein. But yeah, there's a lot of suspicious things, right? There's a lot of suspicious things about his funding, who he may be working for, what kind of governments may be associated with him. That's what I'm really interested in. But
how he died, I'll say it. How he died.
Sure. Well, I was with you on the day that it happened. But maybe we don't maybe there's but maybe in terms of a client list and stuff like that, maybe they don't have something that's like as extensive as we would like. I don't know. But Loomer is correct that if there is something, they are covering up for pedophiles, right? And you have prominent people in Trump world who are clearly linked to Epstein in some way, and Trump, right? And Alan Dershowitz, among other things, like hardcore. And it's like a big MAGA personality now, even though he went back and forth between Republican and Democrat, I believe, in his career. So you have these people that I'm sure they're not going to want to embarrass in there, right? There has been obviously the Clinton Association, but there are, there may be people they don't want to associate. And then there's also, who knows how this may affect their, foreign governments with which they're associating themselves. So yeah, they gave him a bunch of bullshit. Like, they gave him a little ball of yarn to play with, and hoped that the audience was so dumb that they wouldn't demand more. Well, guess what? Some of these people actually do believe in QAnon. Some of them really think they're saving children. So you got to give them better than that. That's the one thing. And the other thing I was going to say about this, like my take, is just like, this was the first moment I actually felt good. Not good. Nothing makes me feel good anymore, but this is the first time I ever felt slightly like maybe we can imagine the base turning on Trump somewhere, right? It would require an economic downturn, sadly, that's going to affect all of us. I don't think there's any way this turns without people experiencing economic hardship, and that means me and you and everybody else, and that sucks. But when you saw them kind of turn and be like, hey, there's no, there's nothing behind this, like there's nothing behind the curtain here. People got super pissed, and I could see that same populist rage turning on MAGA if people's living conditions are unpleasant.
I think it's also worth remembering during the first Trump administration, as things went on, whether it was policies or attempts to push policies through, the courting of this weird influencer vibe, it lost popularity, and ultimately he lost re-election to Joe Biden, whose whole campaign was just like, I am a cup of vanilla pudding. Yeah. Wouldn't you rather have that than Drano? Yeah. Another way to look at this is that this is like a peak of the kind of cracks that can form even within the base, which, even downgrading somebody from a fanatic to a skeptic, I feel like is a step in the right direction. And it's still so early. The administration is just has its foot on the gas pedal. And this is maybe hopium or some form of, too much optimism. But if they go too fast and freak people out too much, or disappoint people too much, or, they just go too hard, too fast, will that kind of support erode? Another place that we saw this happening was when Andrew and Tristan Tate, who are men's influencers, I struggle to describe these people. I hear people use the word manosphere content creators, but I don't. That term almost feels too sanitized for me.
It's so much worse than that, though. They're the most extreme version of that, right?
They're hyper misogynist, is what they are.
They're misogynist extremists, I guess.
So they were charged with participating in a criminal ring that were sexually exploiting women in Romania. Andrew Tate has been charged with rape. They deny those allegations, but U.S. authorities lifted travel restrictions on Andrew and Tristan Tate, who made their way down to Florida. And, the Tate brothers are, in some parts of the MAGA movement, like a form of royalty, right? That sort of hyper misogynistic, hyper macho, just aggressive sort of personality resonates with part of the audience in some way, especially younger audiences of younger men. Right?
Alex Jones also helped. He was
right.
like he brought him on a lot.
But then the Ben Shapiro's, Daily Wire, some of the more establishment type conservatives, even Ron DeSantis, governor of Florida, was not particularly thrilled about this.
To be able to deal with this, but the reality is no, Florida is not a place where you're welcome with that type of conduct in the air. And I don't know how it came to this. We were not involved. We were not notified. I found out through the media that this
people who don't know what Andrew Tate talks about. I mean, like, I almost don't even feel comfortable. Like, I'm just too shy to talk, like, even describe some of the stuff he says about women. But it's horrific. It's basically like, I mean, just that you're just essentially women are like these disposable articles. They're like fleshlights, and you get them pregnant, and you just leave them all over the place to deal with their pain. And it's actually like, it's like exciting when they're sad after you ruin their lives and stuff like that. It's like truly grotesque. And it's like, if you have like any woman in your life who you feel anything for, it should make you feel, you don't even have to be a decent guy. It should make you feel horrified. So, yeah, I mean, it is pretty insane. But there are people who are associated with Elon Musk's Doge team who like have been shown like they was one of them was like went to Andrew Tate's university or whatever and had a degree. That was one of the leaks. I mean, these are the type of people who are in there, and I'm sure they're pulling strings to try to get, fans are trying to pull strings to get these guys here.
So the Trump administration, the MAGA movement, has always valued its influencers, right? They view them, I think, almost even more important than they think of things like Fox News. During the first Trump administration, they had the social media summit where they invited a bunch of right-wing personalities to come take pictures, they, again, patting them on the back, saying, thanks, keep posting, you rock. But the opening of the gates to social media personalities or just media personalities in general, I think has been, the gates have been taken off the hinges in this administration. I think you have Kash Patel, who does have some national security experience, but has spent the last handful of years as a, media personality playing footsies with QAnon, or Dan Bongino, a former Secret Service guy who is just a, idiot, rock brain, conservative pundit at this point, and wears shirts that are like socialism sucks and juices lemons on camera and stuff. It's like, it's just.
He's the deputy director of the FBI.
Yeah. He's the deputy director, so he's going to be overseeing most of the day-to-day stuff, But it's, and then you have like Jack Posobiec, who joined on an overseas trip with the Pentagon. He's traveling in the Envoy for some reason. You wrote a piece on your Substack called "Save Us from the MAGA Ass Kissers" that kind of covered some of this. Andy No, who our favorite right-wing journalist, who we quoted at the top of the show, he's trying to get through the door. It's like open season, and there's a lot of...
Yeah, well, I mean, so like all these influencers now have access to power in a way that is truly disturbing, because these are not exactly the best and brightest Americans from my experience in dealing with them. And that's how you get stuff like Andrew Tate coming to the US, because people are lobbying internally and they have access to power. And then that's how you have stuff like, Kash Patel, Dan Bongino, at running the FBI. And people like Andy No can access these people simply just by tweeting at them or DMing them if they're mutual follows. And who knows where that could actually lead. The only saving grace is the incompetency I spoke about before. And we have to hope that is what carries us.
This feels like a good place to pivot to our conversation with J.M. Berger. We talked about extremism and what it is at its core. What is extreme in the year 2025? Joining Posting Through It now, we have J.M. Berger, someone that Mike and I have read an awful lot about. J.M., welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Can you tell folks a little bit about who you are, what you've done in your career? Because, real heads like Mike and I, whose brains are just filled with poison and worms, have been reading you for a long time. In my case, since the beginning of my career, I've looked to your work to instruct my own approach. But can you fill in listeners a little bit about who you are?
Sure. My background was in journalism. I did a bunch of fairly unremarkable journalism jobs up until about 2001, when I was working for a .com that was caught up in the .com bubble. And after I lost that job, I basically spent a lot of time casting seeds into the wind and working on stuff that I thought was interesting and shit posting about it. And eventually, some of that activity started to coalesce into a real interest in extremism and terrorism, particularly. So I started studying domestic extremist movements and Al-Qaeda, and as part of my explorations of that, I got into a lot of stuff about the Bosnia War, which led me to meet up with a documentary team from Norway that was doing something on Bosnia. And sort of brick by brick, I sort of found myself having a career in this and a lot of other stuff kind of getting crowded out. I sort of hit critical mass around 2011 where I was, really in a position where I said, either I need to make a career of this or I need to go work at Trader Joe's. And so I wrote my first book, which is called Jihad Joe, and it's about American jihadists. And that book was kind of my entree into academia because it was of some interest to the general public, but it was much more of interest to the sort of cottage industry that was growing up around Al-Qaeda and terrorism. And so I began to be offered opportunities to work in academia, to write papers and do other kinds of activities, and I took them. And it's been a very slow process that culminated strangely just a couple of months ago with me getting my PhD in criminology with a focus on extremism. So it's not a career path I would recommend to anybody, but it kind of sort of worked out, except now I have a PhD in extremism at a time when higher ed is collapsing and especially funding for work on extremism. So,
wow. I will tell you, as somebody who started as a playwright and left that to become a journalist and was able to finally get things together, and now journalism is doing this. I don't think there's any good options for people who are kind of in intellectual fields in general.
I minored in philosophy and majored in journalism in college, and I used to just tell people that I was studying so that I wouldn't make any money. I was looking for a job that made no money. So
my undergraduate studies were in English lit and film studies, so I can relate.
I just quickly, I read extremism before I started working at SPLC because someone said, I felt like, oh my God, I've got a huge burden here to, I got to really, up my game. I'd written about far right extremists quite a bit before then, but I was like, this is serious now. We're going to have to these labels are really important, blah, blah, blah. So I read extremism then, and I go back to it frequently, your book. And I'm just curious, it's 2025 now, it's 7 years after you published it. And I just want to know what is going on now in this country is the first thing. And what would you do differently now given the landscape that we're looking at?
Well, I think, the book was sort of intended to be a very tight overview of the field and to establish some terms for talking about extremism. So I feel pretty good about where that is. And I just, finished my dissertation, which is really like my extended thoughts on the same topic. So the dissertation takes that it's a slim little book, Extremism. It's part of the MIT Essential Knowledge series, which is meant to just be kind of introductory stuff for lay people. And I kind of snuck a theory book in there under the guise of doing an introductory book. Which
I was about to say it's got a lot more punch than that for me. But yeah.
Well, that's good. Thank you. Yeah. So it was kind of a stealth way to establish an academic piece. In a relatively small format it was built off of a lot of stuff I had been doing. So the dissertation, which is called The Social Construction of Extremism, is really, if I was, what I would do differently is I would write the dissertation. So it's got a much more in-depth look at a lot of these issues. There's a whole chapter on defining extremism, which is kind of the key contribution I think the book made. And I did a review of the literature to see what other definitions were out there and critique them and sort of talk about how certain kinds of definitions of extremism give privilege to power in a way that is kind of problematic. And, the definition that I put in the book, which is that extremism is the belief that an in-group can never be successful or survive without being engaged in hostile action against an out-group. And a lot of the definitions in this space really had to do with, the power of a movement. So a lot of definitions of extremism were just extremism is weird people who are off on the sides of society by definition, and we can't look at them, in any other kind of context. And one of the things that I wanted to establish, for reasons that are probably becoming increasingly clear to everyone, is that extremism can really proceed from the center of society. If extremists' goal is to take over society and then they succeed in that goal, which sometimes they do we stop calling them extremists and we open up a whole different field of study, or is it one thing all the way through? And that's sort of the heart.
Let me stop you there, just because we went past the definition involving in-groups. Really quickly, because a lot of people, this may be hard for them to easily process. Can you just break it down slowly and then maybe talk about it in the context of what we're seeing from MAGA people now, certain MAGA people in particular?
Yeah. So the definition, I'm just actually going to look at a note that I had because I just taught a class on this earlier this week, and it's fresh in my mind from that. So, the definition, just to go slowly, is extremism is the belief that an in-group's success or survival can never be separated from the need for hostile action against an out-group. And there are a couple of components of that I think really, make the argument for this definition versus some of the other ones. First off, extremism is a belief, right? So, if somebody believes in neo-Nazism or somebody believes in ISIS, we call them an extremism, right? You don't have to actually be acting on that belief. They're still an extremist. They might not be a violent extremist until they do something, but they're an extremist. So that's the first plank of this. The second is the idea that the in-group, and it just probably not everybody is familiar with these terms. An in-group is the group to which you belong, to which one belongs, the referent person.
And that could be ideology, it could be racial, it could be religious, a whole host of things.
Yeah. So for the sort of easy explanation of it is that, if you're a neo-Nazi, your in-group is white people. And if you're Al-Qaeda, your in-group is Muslims. And then we break it down. There are ways to break it down. So there's the extremist in-group that believes a certain ideology versus the eligible in-group that is, the broad identity to which people are applying. But basically, the in-group is your group. It's the group that I belong to, and the out-group is people who are not allowed to be in the in-group. So the belief that an in-group's success or survival is really at the heart of extremism. Most extremists, all extremists really believe that the out-group presents some kind of cosmic threat to the health of the in-group, and that it's and the next piece of the definition says that it can never be separated from the need for hostile action against an out-group. So never be separated is sort of a key thing. The idea is that an extremist believes that people who are in the outgroup are intrinsically bad because of who they are and not necessarily because of anything that they're doing. They will cite things that they think the outgroup is doing, but really their belief is that the outgroup is completely irredeemably bad, and there's no room for compromise there. And then the last plank of the definition is hostile action. So I think, this was possibly, when I wrote the book, was less obvious to people than it might be now, but there's like a whole range of things that extremists can do that are not violence. Some of the definitions in the literature, in the academic literature and the policy literature, specify that extremists have to be violent. And in fact, there's a whole lot of things that are recognizably extremist activities, like, online mobbing, doxing, verbal harassment, campaigns of verbal harassment. These are all activities that we understand to be extremist, but they're not violent. So we really have to understand, like, the hostile action is happening on a spectrum that starts with, like, very low, almost, in things that you would not give a second thought to, or it wouldn't stick with you for very long, shunning, or people who go off to live in a isolated compound with other people in their identity group. And then it goes from these things, which are, fall into the definition of extremism, but maybe, you're not going to turn the whole society against somebody for that kind of activity. But then it scales up to terrorism and sort of the last extreme is genocide.
I think that's a lot more workable of a definition, which is why I tend to favor it, than, as you mentioned before, what a lot of other academic or even some research organizations historically have used to try to classify extremists, and I feel like it maybe comes from a well-intentioned place, right? It's like we want these kind of movements, these kind of ideologies, extremism, to be extreme. We want it to be the other thing over there. That's not us. You hear this, like, after the Capitol riot, That's not America. That's not who we are. This is a radicalized little group of people that are taking it too far, et cetera, et cetera. But as we'll talk later, I think those definitions can quickly become unworkable, right? Like, one of my and some stories I wrote at the time played into this as well, I'll admit. But, like, you write a story about somebody like Mike Cernovich, a Pizzagator, male supremacist kind of guy, and to describe him as like a fringe figure doesn't really work when he's like hanging out in the White House, or somebody like Stephen Miller, who some of Mike's reporting revealed had a affinity, like a very strong interest in various racist and white nationalist blogs. But he is, effectively the prime minister of this country. If we're going to think about a different government model, he is the architect of policy in MAGA. So if the definition requires it to be other or to be on the fringe, then it becomes unworkable. And this is part of why we wanted to have you on this week, is because if we're thinking about it that way, then talking about it to friends, family members, you see it in media a little bit, it kind of struggles to like make it work when people that believe these things or take this kind of approach to politics are driving the car. And if we're in like a MAGA, I won't say monoculture, but dominant kind of cultural force moment right now,
can it be extreme? Can that be extremism? Yes, I guess is the question. Yeah.
So, I mean, part of the problem, I think, is that prior to September 11th, there was not a ton of research on extremism as a phenomenon. And even to this day, there's not really an extremism field. I mean, I am kind of the field, me and a handful of other people. most people work on this who came to it from terrorism. And so they created very bespoke definitions. Everybody would write a paper, and if they would assume that everybody knew what you meant when you talked about extremism, or they would just put some kind of bespoke definition in there to hold the place. And, when I went through the literature, there were 5 different types. One was the one we've been talking about, and this was like the most commonly used. It's like in a plurality of the cases I reviewed, which is that extremism is a belief that's far outside the social norm. And, the problem with that is it's all extremely relative framing. So the social norm changes, and then the definition of extremism changes. So you have this unstable category if you're trying to study what extremism is and understand what it is. And it's also runs into a problem where it sort of criminalizes dissent or minority status. If belief far removed from societal norms could, for instance, mean Buddhists in the United States. They have beliefs that are well outside the mainstream of U.S. beliefs. So are they extremists, or Mormons? Are they extremists? We're talking about groups that are like, 1% or a fraction of percent of U.S. population. They would seem to be extremists under that definition. The other definitions are similarly kind of complicated. One just says, like, if you use certain kinds of criminal violence, that makes you an extremist. Mostly that's just intended to capture terrorism and nothing else. Or hate crimes. Sometimes they'll include hate crimes and that kind of thing. There's a definition that says that any opposition to the state is extremism. That's probably where we're headed right now in this country, is that there's going to be an argument made that anybody who's opposed to the state is an extremist and therefore subject to extreme measures to suppress them. This is very popular. The definition is used in China and Russia, for instance. Then there are a couple of other people sort of try to reverse engineer what extremism is from looking at extremists. So they say, like, extremists are people who have, very rigid beliefs or very inflexible, or they, something like that. And the problem with that is that first off, it's not really good scientific method, right? It's selecting on the dependent variable kind of issue. And then secondly, the characteristics that people describe about extremists are often sort of complicated and not that accurate. So, the last class of definition, and that's the one that mine falls into, talks about extremism basically as, in one way or another, extremism is a force that is committed to creating and prosecuting intergroup conflicts. So, you can then we get into some sort of fine-grained, sort of around the edges stuff that we probably don't need to talk about here. That's just, like, is this an extremist? Is that an extremist? And, you can never get rid of all the gray areas, but I'm hopeful that my definition is less gray than a lot of the other alternatives.
Well, I want to touch on something you said there, which I thought was really pertinent, which is about this, the relationship to the state and stuff like that, because one of the toughest things about this has always been, like, since the kind of Trump movement arose, and there's been different there's been legitimate terroristic violence, like what we saw in El Paso, and there's been stuff like Pizzagate, and there have been like harassment mobs, and I've gotten like tons of death threats and stuff, right? It's been quite an interesting, unpleasant decade since he announced his run. So now they're in power, and they're aligned. They appear to be aligning themselves with Putin's, regime and stuff like that. And we know what kind of oppression goes on there. There's been this stuff about Antifa and far left, thing that has been kind of like along partisan lines, where it's sort of like, you have your extremism, we have our extremism, right? And there has been, of course, left-wing violence on the streets, right? There was, there was a shooting between sort of Antifa protester and somebody in Patriot Prayer in 2020, in the summer of 2020, things like that. They're going to almost, if they get themselves organized well enough to do it, and or whatever, they're going to almost certainly try to exploit this story about left-wing extremism in order to justify the very extremist tendency. So how can we possibly unhook this from this partisan, this sort of pre-built partisan, you watch MSNBC, we watch Fox News, situation, and actually get people to see that state oppression for what it is? Because I just want to add that there's been very little Antifa protesting recently in general, but it's going to come back, and little things are going to be exploited.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's nothing that a guy like me is going to be able to do to stop that from happening. What we can do as academics, and what I hope to see people doing, is that we can not be complicit in that, and that we can stick to some kind of objective or reasonably nonpartisan definition. And, I designed this definition to be that. And it doesn't mean that I personally have no opinions or alignment with an ideology of, right and wrong and where society should be going. But I tried to build a structure that captured, and again, this is all reverse engineering. It's not a perfect way to approach this, but I tried to do something that would capture most of the groups that there's a consensus are extremist groups, so neo-Nazis and ISIS and Al-Qaeda always start from there, because those are what people mostly think about. And then ask what unites those things, and then spread it out from there. So, what we'll see on the right in this country is they'll talk about things like, and I get this question sometimes when I do events, they'll ask about Black Lives Matters and Black Lives Matter extremists. And it's like, the answer is no, because they're not prescribing a hostile action. Black Lives Matter is like asking to have the humanity of your group acknowledged. They're not, Black Lives Matter has no agenda to kill people, to do this, that, or the other thing. And it's just a left-aligned group, and they want to demonize it as extremist.
Now, I should add, it's not really even a group. It's more a protest movement, right? Like that's one of the things, that's a sort of sleight of hand that like figures like Andy Ngo and some of these people do, is they'll just be like, they'll use word like members and group when it's a protest movement of loosely disconnected leftists.
Yeah, and that always gets tricky too for people. When we're talking about MAGA too, it's not like a group. It doesn't have membership rules, but it is a recognizable movement. Yeah. So I usually do use the word movement when I'm talking about this. People will come after these kinds of things. They talk about Antifa as a group when it's not really have any kind of organizational structure to speak of. So Black Lives Matter is like an easy call, right? So another one that people will point to and call leftist extremism is Black nationalism, like more active Black nationalism, like we saw back in the 60s and 70s. And there's a better case for that. And, in some cases, movements that sort of style themselves as Black nationalism are just asking for civil rights and equality, but some are actually trying to say, like, we should have a Black state, and we should reverse, due to the white people in our state, what they did to the Black people in their state. And so you can talk about it with some of those groups, and then we get into sort of the failure of the right-left kind of labels, because, Black nationalists were classified as left-wing extremism because their affinity groups are on the left of our political spectrum. But the actual things it believes are pretty indistinguishable from what white nationalists believe. So,
they're also really not much. There's really not much of it. Like, I would just say, like, that was one of the like things that I picked up on it. I didn't cover it at all at SPLC, but I remember there was a huge debate whether they wanted to keep it or not. Yeah. And like, there's really just not that much of it.
No, it's a very, and all these movements are cyclical, right? So you have times when things go up and times when things go down. And, the 60s and into the 70s, there was a lot of left-wing terrorism in this country, and a lot of groups that you could really pretty credibly argue are extremists. And then, by the numbers, what we see is white nationalism, and some of the sort of adjacent movements to that are just much more numerically strong than any of these left-wing extremist groups have been in a long time. So, left-wing extremism is something that can exist. My definition is intended to allow a discussion of it, and I think that it's particularly useful. It's useful to look at some of these Weather Underground and some of the groups from the 70s and compare them to their corresponding organizations on the right, because that's how we learn. Comparative studies, the definition of extremism that I put out here is meant to empower comparative study, right? It's so that we can say these are apples to apples kinds of groups, and what can we learn by seeing how they're similar and how they're different. And so I think it's useful and important to do left-wing studies, but it's also, you have to kind of read the room a bit and see what's happening in this country and respond to that. So
changing gears a little bit, but I think this kind of builds on what we've been talking about. You've written in recent years about a concept that the term you use is lawful extremism. And I think that kind of gets back to the sort of prevailing, I don't want to say dominant, but a major way of thinking about extremism as something on the fringe. But, you looked at a few cases through history of things the U.S. government has done or governments have done, and asked the question, is it extremism? If the government is doing it, if it is elected into power by people, passes laws or works under existing laws to make it happen, is that really extremism? Or because it's in a literal sense democratic. It is democracy. They say this is, they're not, it's the way I've thought about it is using democracy for undemocratic means, right? That's sort of how I've thought about it. I'm curious if you think about it differently.
As Elon Musk would say, that we have a mandate.
Yeah,
we have a mandate.
We got, we eked out the popular vote, and we have a mandate now. But
a mandate to end Alzheimer's research.
Yeah. Oh God, man. But
sorry.
But I'm curious. First, can you? I'm sure I didn't do the concept any justice there, but can you first talk to us about this idea of lawful extremism that you've written about, and sort of the way I read it, if we think about lawful extremism, it kind of brings into tighter focus this need for really trying to be more precise about how we're prescribing extremism altogether. And I think supports your working definition, that comparative definition, in a strong way.
Yeah. So, the definition very deliberately does not reference power, right? It doesn't reference dominance, whether it's cultural dominance or political dominance, which are not always the same thing. I think we're in a situation right now where there's a politically dominant movement that is not culturally dominant, and that's a scenario where bad things can happen. But ultimately, when I wrote this definition, I reverse engineered it from studying Christian identity movement, which was a fringe movement. And I wasn't really thinking about this piece of it that much when I did that. But then after I had the definition and sat with it for a while, it became clear to me that, this can definitely include actions that are done by a dominant social movement. And so I remember particularly I got into a pretty heated argument back on Twitter in the old days.
R.I.P. to Twitter.
Yeah, with Mark Pitcabbage from the ADL, and he was it was over slavery, and it was I was saying, yes, racial slavery is extremism, and he was like, no, that can't be, that's no good. And a lot of people, I'm not trying to diss Mark in any way, I think he's done some amazing work. But a lot of people in the field would agree with that. It's you can't point to the enslavement of people on the basis of race as a social enterprise as extremist, because it was just the values of the day, and everybody believed that this was right, and so you can't really judge that. And that never sat right with me. And then part of my sort of rejoinder on this is if you look at what Christian identity believes, to just pick one where there's a very clear through line, the beliefs that Christian identity holds there's a straight line that I can draw back to pro-slavery ideologies in the pre-Civil War era, like the components of their belief, the mark of Ham, the mark of Cain and the curse of Ham, which are two biblical justifications for slavery. They originated in sort of earlier times, and then they became very widespread as a defense of enslavement. They're saying, look, the Bible says that white people should be in charge of black people, and that it continues. It's the same thing that Christian identity uses to justify itself. And why would we not talk about these movements as being the same part of the same fabric of white nationalism? So the first paper we did on lawful extremism, I've been working on this. I was working on it on my own for quite a while, and then in collaboration with a great researcher, Beth Davies, who was until recently with CTEC, where I work. And I started with the Dred Scott decision, which is sort of one of the classic, most obvious, easiest layup arguments for extremism that you can find. And the Dred Scott decision, for anybody who doesn't know it, was a Supreme Court decision on slavery. They were asked to define a fairly narrow question concerning an enslaved person, Dred Scott, and who was petitioning for his freedom. And instead of deciding the narrow case, the Supreme Court came back with a sweeping decision that ruled that black people could not be citizens of the United States and did not enjoy the rights provided to white people under the Constitution. So, I started with this because I knew this concept was going to be a bit controversial, and I wanted to just take the easiest shot I could, and I think it was pretty easy to make that argument. The second case was more complicated, but I think still kind of in the not very controversial space, which is we looked at Chinese immigration laws and the exclusion of Chinese people from citizenship in the United States, and Asian people more broadly as the time went on. And again, this was a case where we were thinking this would be particularly relevant to current events because the authors of the legislation took great pains not to advertise the extremist intent behind it, the animus toward the outgroup, that sort of thing, because that has often been a grounds on which a court will throw something out, is if it's motivated by animus toward the outgroup. So there's this, their actual law itself doesn't contain a lot of stuff that you can clearly make the argument about the definition of extremism, but when you look at the debate that preceded it, and we have a really extensive chronicle of the hearings and congressional hearings and stuff that preceded the passage of this law, that's where you see it. Then it's like, oh, okay, this is all over the place. This is about white people being better than Chinese people, and whether there are a lot of debates about whether Chinese people were better and worse than black people, and it's like this clearly works. And then the third paper we did was on Florida's anti-trans laws, and there, and again, I'll say we thought this was going to be extremely relevant going forward, is that they took great pains when Florida was passing its bathroom laws and other laws that intended to, criminalize trans identities, basically. In the hearings, they were extremely careful not to say anything that indicated that they were motivated by animus, because that would potentially be a grounds for a court to strike it down. When you looked at their activities outside the hearings and things they said, then you could see it more, and it became more clear. And we thought it was going to be pretty important to understand this, because we expected that the Trump administration, which it wasn't a slam dunk when we started writing the paper, but by the time we finished it, it was starting to look pretty. We published it after the election, so we knew it was going to be an issue. And we thought the Trump administration would follow that model of sort of, not embedding the extremist language in the documents, but just, writing things that were very indirect and elusive, and that we would need to be able to read the tea leaves to understand it in the same way as we did with the Florida laws. And instead, the Trump administration has just put out executive orders that are quite explicit about what they're doing, and there's really not very much ambiguity. So
let's talk about that, because trans people are like the biggest scapegoat of the MAGA movement. right now. I mean, actually, you could say immigrants,
if there's
Latino immigrants.
Canary in the coal mine. It's trans people.
I mean, I reported out of India before I came here and started doing this type of work, and I know that male to female trans community there goes back over 1,000 years, right? This is a trans people have always existed essentially, and that doesn't mean they've always been recognized, and that's very different. But some of these moves, like removing the T from LGBT, right? I mean, I can see where it would be difficult to argue that's extremist because, 20 years ago, they wouldn't have even acknowledged, gay people, right? So how do we, I feel like it's so important to kind of draw the line here and to stand up for trans people in this moment. But people are just treating it as if, well, okay, this is new and that's the choice and so forth. So they're just kind of going to ignoring it. But it really feels like a lot of this is exactly what you're talking about, lawful extremism.
Yeah. So, I mean, the executive orders that they've put out have been pretty clear about what they think. This references to gender ideology sort of conveniently provides your outgroup space. So, we saw this in the Florida laws too, that the outgroup's not just trans people, but it's also anybody who supports trans people. Like there's an effort to really cut off, any mainstream support for trans people. So in Florida, for instance, doctors who provided gender affirming care to minors could be prosecuted. And so, when you look at an extremist movement, we tend to think of it as just, what are they doing to the outgroup? But it's not just that. They're trying to isolate the outgroup by punishing anybody in the in-group who has any kind of sympathies for them. And this crusade against gender ideology that we're seeing is really exactly that. I mean, and it's going much further, much faster than I would have expected. I mean, I would not say that anything that's happened so far in the Trump administration has surprised me. I would say that it has surprised me how efficiently they've managed to go about it, given how much chaos there was in the previous administration. I figured it would be a slower process, but we're right out of the gate with this. So, when you're erasing the T from LGBT, I mean, that's really sending a message, and it's all of this is aimed at sort of demonizing and denying the concept of trans identity. So they're going much further than the Florida law did, which is just like, oh, we're putting, haha, air quotes, common sense regulations around this. And we're not trying to, they said explicitly, like, we're not trying to erase trans identity, although one person was pressed on it and kind of did concede a little bit in the hearing. But mostly they're just saying, like, we're not trying to prosecute trans people for being trans. We're just trying to protect children, which was the main thrust of most of the stuff, or protect women and children. And all that's out the window. This is just like, now they're just saying, like, this is gender ideology is bad. It's evil. There's a crisis narrative about it, mutilating children and undermining, society. And they're putting it right in the text of the laws. So all this kind of, we build out this kind of analytical structure to understand how, rhetoric that took place outside the law explains what's in the law, because the law itself is, Beth Davies characterized it. She said, the law is a sparse text, right? It's just, the law itself is typically just a few lines that say, this is the thing we're doing. And it doesn't explain typically within the body of the law why you're doing it and what your attitudes are. Whereas this stuff, these executive orders, are kind of free-form, prose poetry about the people they hate, and it's much clearer, that they're intending to criminalize trans identity in all its forms and to push trans people out of society. And everything they've done is really very clear on that. And Jared mentioned the canary in the coal mine, and I've seen people object to that, and I think rightly, that metaphor, because the canary in the coal mine is there because it's expendable. And
yeah, fair, fair enough.
So the idea that there are two pieces of this, and one is that, like, we should be outraged on the face of it for what they're doing, and then for people some people in society who are not, for whatever reason, they don't care about this issue as much. Maybe they're not, full on maniacs about it like this administration is, but they aren't invested in trans issues, and those people need to understand, it would be better if they understood that this is just bad objectively and by itself on the face of it, but they should also understand that this is just the beginning, and there are going to be so many more groups of people targeted in this way. And
that's a huge point.
Yeah. So, I mean, point. I think extremism, we can talk about the MAGA movement as extremist, but what it really is a fascist movement, and fascist movements employ extremism in a utilitarian way to cement their control. And they can and often usually do believe the things that they're saying that are extremist, but it's more, the more important thing about how they use extremism is that it's a tool for control. It's a way to crush dissent. You try and wipe out a group, and the unlikely event that you succeed in wiping out that group, it's happened only rarely that extremist movements have been that successful, but it does happen every once in a while. And what happens is, after they wipe out that group, they find a new group to go after. So this is the beginning, not the end. And, we should stand for trans people on the basis of standing up for trans people. And then we should also be concerned about how this is going to snowball into a much bigger and even more toxic program that is going to hurt even more people.
So
as we talk about this, we're only 6 weeks in. That's also a big point.
So my takeaway from this conversation has been that, regardless of the power that a political movement gains, extremism is extremism, and it's more helpful to think about the mechanisms that it's using or that define it rather than its place in society. As we're going into the down ramp here and wrapping things up, this conversation, might be, there's been a lot to chew on in this conversation, especially to somebody I, often think if my dad listened to this, or my father-in-law, my mother-in-law, whatever, who do not steep in this 40 hours a week professionally, what would they think of it? And, I think maybe a good way to wrap this up is to hear from you, JM, on why thinking about these kind of definitions or thinking about it in this way, why identifying extremism is important, or what the value is in this to the average person. What are they to make of it? How are they to think of it? It's more practical to somebody like myself, who's a researcher or a journalist or whatever. But to the average individual, what's the utility in this?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the first piece has to do with understanding that movements don't necessarily change their inherent structure when they become popular or dominant. And so the example I usually use for this is the Nazis. So the Nazis, if you look at the 1920s, if we're doing the center of society definition, in the 1920s, the Nazis are extremists. Then in the 1930s, at some point, they suddenly stopped being extremist. And then in the 1950s, they're extremist again. And it's like, what changed about what they believe and how they act? Nothing. So it's important, I think, to understand that these groups are, these movements are fundamentally the same when they're in power, when they're not in power. The difference is that when they're in power, they can wreak so much more damage on society. They can do things that are unimaginable for a fringe group to do, such as genocide, such as concentration camps, and the kind of stuff we're seeing now. So I think it's important to understand that, when we talk about extremism, we're talking about really this kind of activity that is, usually based on hate for an outgroup, and that hate is manifesting itself into society in ways that it can't, if you sort of shrug off your bigoted neighbor, 10 years ago, you would just, shrug that person off because they can't really do a lot of damage to society. And now those are the people running things. So, we need to sort of be able to confront that in a very direct way, and to understand both, what is extremist, and especially as we're going to get into this government weaponizing the concept of extremism, we need to be able to understand what is not extremism. So, when protesters show up, to protest these policies, they are not extremists. They're not, unless they're calling for a genocide of people wearing red hats, they're not extremists. It is completely reasonable behavior to go out there and stand up for what you believe, and to disagree with, that up until now, it's been a fundamental truth about the United States that, disagreement is not criminal, dissent is not criminal, and, we, even if they make dissent criminal, they shouldn't, we shouldn't accept that framing. And the other thing about the definition I would just say is that, what I really tried to do is to build a definition that is based on this kind of identity-based activity, program of activity that is, between one group and another. And it's, very deliberately constructed not to be a political test of, what your views are. It's really just intended to capture the type of movement that this is, and hopefully by understanding the type of movement that it is, we can figure out ways to counter it and to get people to look at it more, honestly, and confront the ugly things in it, and, not just sort of brush it off as like, well, everybody's saying it. One of the things I got into with the Dred Scott paper was there's this idea that, the Supreme Court Justice Roger Taney was a product of his time, and that he was a man of his day, and you can't really judge him because everybody else believed the same thing he did, which I just ripped into that very aggressively in the paper, because it's just not, first off, it's not true, and then secondly, who cares? Some things can be, right or wrong. Enslaving people can be wrong. It's wrong whether it's popular or not. And so, just because this movement is in control of the levers of power doesn't mean that we should accord it any kind of legitimacy.
Well, JM, thanks for joining us. Before we let you go, I'll say JM's written a handful of great books. We'll include links to them and his other stuff in the description of this episode. Go check it out. Highly recommended from both podcast hosts here. JM, anything else you want to plug before you get out of here?
No, I'm working on some stuff. So it's all, if I can get something off the ground, and some serious stuff, and some, somewhat less serious stuff projects that I'm working on to keep my sanity during these times. So I'm hoping to roll some of that stuff out soon, but
that's a good question to kind of end it on, because this is heavy stuff or whatever, but like, how are you keeping sane? I'm just curious.
With a lot of difficulty. I keep busy working on it. In some ways, it's very difficult working on these issues in this environment, and then in other ways, at least you feel like you can do something about it. And when I can't really take it anymore, I'll get into a video game, or most effectively, I'll write fiction. And that's like my best escape from this, because it completely engages the entirety of my brain and lets me, just go somewhere else for a few hours.
Have you played Silent Hill 2? Because I was I got my kids a PlayStation, and I was recommended. I was like, "Oh, Mike, you need to play Silent Hill 2." And I hadn't played video games in forever, and I will say, it was like a very intense experience, very Lynchian like atmosphere. I really liked it.
Yeah, I haven't tried it. I heard that about Alan Wake too, which is another one, because I love Lynch, I love Twin Peaks, and I'm very interested in that. But also, my reflexes aren't what they used to be. So
I put it on easy mode, man. I don't even mess around. I got things to do.
Turn-based games. I go for the turn-based stuff. Like, it's like where I could, I don't have to like get my hands seized up by the end of an hour.